All right, just say something into the mic for me. Hey, all right, awesome.
We did it.
All right, we did it. All right, hello. Hello, hello, hello. It's Monday evening, it's 7 o'clock, and I need to put my announcer voice on. And it's time for CubeCon interviews. Yeah. Hi.
Hi.
We've still had people trickling in, but we might as well just start it up now.
Great.
So, I'm Derek, and this is my stream, and I have my special guest of the week here, Istical, Work-Life Value. You can introduce yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm Jade Schneider. I live in New York City. I've been playing Magic for 20 years now, off and on. And I'm the designer of one of the selected cubes that's going to be featured in the main cube event at CubeCon, which is the Devoid Cube.
Yes. You started playing Magic 20 years ago?
Started playing Magic in the summer of 2003. So right as Judgment was ending and Onslaught was sort of coming in and starting. So the first set I learned how to draft was Onslaught. That's sort of where I started playing. You know, my first deck was a bunch of random rares that someone handed to me, this sort of like Invasion, Judgment, kitchen table times. So yeah, it's been a lot of time. I took time off in college. I just didn't have a play group that I was super excited about in the small college in Iowa that I went to. And I ended up skipping Kamigawa block to play Versus, which was another super fun TCG that was really, really well designed until it wasn't, and then it died.
That was the system. That was the game system that Patrick Sullivan was part of, right?
I don't know everyone who touched it. Like, Kibler was sort of an early adopter and player of it. I don't know if he was also on the design team and was sort of influencing around it. It got a lot of play. Like, I mean, there were pro level events in New York City. There was like a whole pro circuit sort of tier thing. And by the time I sort of qualified on ranking for that, the game had pretty much ended. So it was a really, really great game. It was a really in-depth strategic game, but it kind of cracked under the weight of its own challenges. Essentially, every different superhero team had like one mechanic. So imagine that instead of black having like paying life for things and low cost aggro and recursion, imagine each one of those was its own unique color.
Okay.
And then you need to come up with 4 new ones every single set, or you start revisiting old ones. And then they just started making balance mistakes and the types of things that happened. They had sort of like 3 blocks in a row where a bunch of absolutely broken decks happened, and then they kind of cut all the funding for the pro circuit. I have a Versus cube, which I can bring to CubeCon if people are super interested in it. But it's a great game, very, very complex. And I love it, but that can be a conversation for another day.
It's called Versus system, right?
Yeah, Versus. As DC and Marvel comic book characters, and kind of each set alternated between the two of them.
Wild.
Yeah. So CubeCon 2, when we start adding cubes from non-Magic games, we can I'll bust that out.
The Versus system cube.
It's on CubeCobra. I did an absolutely insane thing where I uploaded individual pictures that I took with my phone of every card in the cube, mapped them to Magic cards, and then used the custom image thing that CubeCobra lets you do.
Oh my God.
To sort of like put up your own altars or whatever. And so you can literally, it's a tiny cube. It's like 270. You can draft it on CubeCobra if you want.
I mean, here it is.
Yeah.
This is so funny.
So I really love Cube, and I really love that game, and hopefully this sort of talks people through it. But yeah, if you mouse over any of the cards and sort of let that image generate, it will show you a versus card that is either thematically similar to it or is like mechanically similar to it. I spent a lot of time on this.
That is insane that you did this. Wow. Oh, that's sick. Okay. Wow. I know nothing about this. This is great.
Yeah. Another time, we'll put together an opportunity for people to learn how to play versus.
Interesting. That's dedication. I wish Cobra's custom interface was easier to manage or bulk upload. Well, maybe one day. It's open source, so I guess give it long enough and let's just start solving bigger problems, right?
If you build it, it may come.
It may come.
I mean, this is certainly not the appropriate use case for CubeCon at all. That was an insane thing that their features and functionality let me do that I'm very proud of. And every once in a while, I will go into the playtesting and I'll just be like, what is a draft of I want to draft Common Enemy, which is the team up of the Doom faction and the Fantastic Four faction, and it was like one of the big like constructed decks at the time. I'm like, I'm gonna go in and draft Common Enemy, but yeah, that's an odd thing that I did.
All right. Well, I guess I'm interested in learning, so I'll bug you about that at some point. Okay, so you started playing in Odyssey, and you quit when you went to college. So when did you start playing Magic again?
I started playing Magic again much more consistently at M10. Essentially, they reprinted Lightning Bolt, and I was like, I'm in, done, sold. So that was the core set leading into Zendikar, which was a glorious and magical time for people who like to cast Lightning Bolt. That was, the first iteration of Jund had just sort of come out, so we had Bloodbraid into Blightning was playable then, but it was also the mono red deck that was like Geopedes and Fetches and Goblin Guide all in standard. Yeah. So a lot of joy there. I think I played some kind of like janky Valakut thing because the Titans were first legal then, so like the prime timing into Valakut was a thing that we were doing. We hadn't Scapeshift was legal, but I don't think we'd figured that out yet. Or what? Also wasn't standard legal. So yeah, it really kind of came back for that, and then immediately kind of hopped back into playing older formats. When I first started playing Magic, about a year after I started playing Vintage, budget Vintage, but like I was playing, what used to be called Suicide Black, which is now, mono black aggro with a very healthy, lose life mechanic to it. A little bit of a precursor to Death Shadow, but if Death Shadow could also play Dark Ritual. Mono red aggro and more of a burn style deck. I played Rector Tricks. Like I had a whole slew of wacky decks that I played in Vintage. And then when I came back, I started building for Legacy. So I built Legacy Merfolk and Legacy Dredge. Dredge is definitely a deck that is near and dear to my heart. And then at some point, I started building cubes. The first cube I designed was kind of like in a very terribly designed common and uncommon cube. So it was a peasant cube before we called it that. Yeah. And it was the type of cube that's just infinity Muldrifters and 2-for-1s. And the first time we played it, everyone lost to decking. That was it. Just like no one had a creature big enough or a threat big enough or fast enough to do damage. And it was just like infinity, value decks just staring at each other until everyone lost cards. And we literally went to the pile of cards that like we had opened at the draft earlier that day, and we just like we put a Baneslayer Angel straight in because like we needed a threat that is good enough that it can end a game. Yes. And that was sort of like my very first cube level up of like why infinity 2-for-1s just doesn't exactly work. So shortly after that, I built sort of a powered Vintage cube. I didn't own power. It was all proxied. That first cube was 720. I remember the first brutal.
Do you remember what year that was?
That would have been around 2012.
Okay.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. It was like 720. I remember the first brutal slashing of 720 down to 540. And also how much better it played. It was such a more fun experience for everyone. So I had that cube. when I was living in Chicago, there was sort of a week or a monthly board game night at a bar in the city that had a lot of people going to it. This was when Gabby Sparks was living in Chicago, so she drafted that cube when it existed, as she was sort of getting into Magic. So anyone who was sort of like in Chicago, a lot of them were coming to that sort of board game and Magic night. And so I had that cube until about 2017, and then I literally scrapped all of it to fully make beautiful the Devoid Cube, which I built for the first time in 2014, which is when wastes were spoiled.
Right. That was when Battle for Zendikar was spoiled, right?
Yeah, so it was, I think Oath of the Gatewatch was officially when they sort of spoiled wastes. I think in Zendikar they had Devoid, and then the big innovation for Oath of the Gatewatch was colorless mana as an identity.
Yes.
And so there was an article on the free side of Star City by one of their contributors, whose name is Matt Higgs, who I cannot find in social media. Otherwise, I would, credit him and thank him and all of those things. But he wrote an article essentially like, with wastes, we can now do a colorless cube. And his cube was, he had an article in the deadline to write, so his cube was not meticulously designed. It, broke singleton, not out of intentional design, but out of like, here's just an example of a thing you could put together. It was sort of almost rarity restricted in some ways.
Okay.
He had like a weird emblem thing where like you could discard wastes to turn them into like Maelstrom pulses, mitigates that can't hit lands.
Right.
And just, trying to think through like what would the playing parents think. But I thought that idea was really interesting. I'm like, I bet you could build, a real cube around that, where you could really, explore and see what was there. And I went and I built, an initial list, and it wasn't very expensive. And I owned some of the cards already, and at my local F&M place that I was playing in Chicago, shout out to First Aid Comics in Little Italy in Chicago, I happened to pull an EMA foil Force of Will out of an Eternal Masters draft that we did. And so I went to a friend of mine who's a little bit more on the Magic Finance side and a little bit more on the has beautiful EDH deck side.
Yeah.
And I'm like, hey, if I ship you this, can you get me the rest of the cards for this list? And honestly, I think the weirdest thing on it at that point was like a Su-Chi. And this was before a Su-Chi was like a real card or a real money card. And so I made the initial list, and I've been playing with it and tinkering with it ever since.
Awesome. And then, so like you had both the Devoid Cube, a common uncommon cube, and your Powered Cube, and then you like cashed out the Powered Cube in 2017 to go full on into foiling out the Devoid Cube, basically.
Yeah, I mean, the 2017 is Kaladesh, so the big thing coming out of Kaladesh is masterpieces, the invention style masterpieces. So I went very hard on getting the invention style masterpieces, any of the expeditions from BFZ for cards that I want in the cube. And that was sort of the first tier of making it pretty. And then in 2020, when I needed some retail therapy due to COVID, I started adding sort of the older border premium stuff. So that's when I got, my beta Icy Manipulator, my foil Masticore from Destiny, and all of those things. So did a bunch of serious upgrading around then, which was right before a lot of the prices on those things really, really crazy spiked. So I got a little bit lucky on that side. But at the same time, I definitely traded away some Alpha Sarahs that a friend gifted me to buy into inventions. So I've also made mistakes.
I got rid of my beta signed Sarahs as well during COVID, so I feel you. But they moved into something else, and they went to a good home. I think Mark Herberholtz bought my Sarah Angels and like
nice
beta Juggernauts and all that stuff, because I was like cashing out of Alpha Beta to like foil out to basically just foil out the cube.
Many of us have been there. I have made bigger mistakes, which was speculating a little bit too early on foil wastes. I kind of bought those a little bit at their high, and they're now a little less than half of what I paid for them. So that cost me a time twister to have the freedom to do that. But I still am very happy. You know, as we've talked about in the past, I'm the probably the largest holder of TSR foil wastes in the world. I have somewhere between 1 and 2.5% of the total global supply, which is an outrageous thing to have. But certainly speaks to the dedication of me to this cube.
I do love the story of how the old border foil waste even got into the file in TSR too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. I've talked with Gavin about who's had he's had a chance to draft this cube in the past, and when he was putting together the card list of what sort of cards should be in the TSR file, he added in wastes, which actually I think there are a lot of people who would be interested in having old border wastes. I think there's a not small number of people who have sort of colorless EDH decks that they like to play.
Yes.
And so I'm not alone. You know, there are dozens of us, someone asked him, I forget, he told me who at one point, but someone asked him, like, hey, like, is anyone really going to want this sort of old border waste things? And he, having drafted my cube, was very confidently able to say, yes, someone wants this.
Yeah.
Because that was...
I love that. Like, you kind of, like, the image of you is above his head, and he looks over and says, yes.
A little bit. I'm sure there
I know someone that wants this.
I think Shivam on the Commander, the
advisory group?
The advisory group had also talked about how excited he was about the TSR old border waste for decks that he had been building and things like that. So yeah, they are beautiful for whatever that's worth. And I now have a print of the bismuth waste art in my home that I'm very proud of. So.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
When you posted that, I actually thought it was the original, and I was like, damn.
I don't think there is. I think it's digital. But my wallet is a little bit worried because what has already been announced for Jumpstart 2022, which is a product that I believe still exists. It's kind of up in the air. It's unclear to some people if it's still going to exist, given that they're now going to jumpstart for each incremental set.
Yes.
But there's supposed to be like a more modern, focused Jumpstart 2022 that has an Eldrazi pack in it. Now, what an Eldrazi pack means is that there will be some sort of new to Magic Eldrazi, which is exciting. But it also means in Jumpstart world, there's another thing that they tend to include in every pack, which is a unique art land of some kind.
Yes.
So it is possible that there will be new art for a waste that is getting released. They're going to be, I believe, Collector's Booster Jumpstart 2022. So there may be yet a new odd foil waste on the docket for me, and potentially original art for that, which is something that I would quite seriously pursue. Though at the same time, I just saw the price tag on Chris Ron's Karn, the original painting of his new Karn, which clocked in at about 23K. So I don't have pockets ready for that, but I would definitely take a strong look at having original wastes art if that was something I could do.
It'd be sick. Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be kind of the final stamp on it, right? Yeah.
Thrill Rider, favorite card in the cube based on aesthetics.
I'm gonna pull up the cube while you're thinking about this.
It's probably old, the original Masticore in the Palo Parente Masticore in Old Border Foil is something that I really love, that I own. It's a card that, like, I had friends when I was learning Magic just absolutely destroyed me with in a format that was extended. It's really one of the like key cards of me remembering to play Magic.
Sure.
And I got one right before they hit whatever number it says. If you scroll a little bit down in the middle on the buy this card
the
section
foil
of
price.
Scryfall. Yeah, the foil price. It was not that number when I got it. Yeah, this cube has appreciated quite well.
Yeah.
I like that I have a beta Icy. I think that's really nice. I have a beta Nev's disc, which is beautiful. I have an eye out for a beta Chaos Orb. That's sort of my white whale of a very, very expensive card.
Sure.
That I'm not sure I'm ready to outlay the cash for. I also, if he ever reopens commissions, I would also settle for getting Klug to do an alter on the revised Chaos Orb that I have. That would be a consideration for me as well.
Unlimited Chaos Orb you have, right?
Yeah, it's an unlimited one that I have. Yeah, Thrillrider. I'm very excited to hear about the booster slot for artifacts in Mystical Archive, the Mystical Archive style slot in the Brothers War. It would make a lot of sense if they want to have artifacts that are reasonable and interesting in the draft environment without having to overload on colorless. Like they could have kind of almost a dedicated colorless slot for reprints and then not have to have that affect the overall texture and the coloring of artifacts in the primary set, which is one of my many disappointments, is sort of the heavy leaning that the design and development team have taken towards making the more powerful artifacts colored. Very reasonable, given kind of the history of having to ban powerful colorless artifacts, but you know, it means that I don't get a Great Henge or an Ember Cleave or things like that, which
sure.
is a little sad.
It is a little sad, yeah.
I choose to live with it.
Well, hopefully, yeah, Brothers War and March of the Machines gives us something interesting.
Yeah, I usually, I'd say the average is about like 4-ish cards a set tend to make it into the cube for at least testing. This Dominaria United is low, with just 2 at Karn and his Silex. What color artifact do I wish most had Devoid? Honestly, the stuff that would be real big workhorses for me are almost all of the commons and uncommons in Modern Horizons 2. Like all the Arcbound stuff in there would be so interesting to add in. They're really nicely statted compared to sort of purely colorless artifact creatures. They do interesting things, and they would sort of provide a lot of thoughtfulness. So that to me was a place where like I wish that, yeah, Arcbound Shikari is definitely one of those.
Yes.
That's a place for me where I think I would have really loved to have gotten a little bit more out of it. Now, like, did everyone get insane things for their cube for Modern Horizons 2? Yes, that was like the goal of the format was to, you know, replace Modern and give all of our cubes just insanely powerful things, and I certainly benefited from that as well. But if I could really, like, that's kind of the thing that's interesting about the cube is the balance on things like artifact creatures is so, in some ways, feels dated, right? It, in many ways, like, artifact creatures that are purely colorless have not seen the power creep that all colored creatures have seen, and even that colored artifact creatures have seen, right? Like, I don't have Esper Sentinel. That card's absolutely bonkers great. I don't, you know, those are not things that I necessarily need access to,
right.
But like, you know, Goblin Pikers still pretty viable in this cube. You know, 3/2s for 2 are hitting sort of nicely in their play level. And so it's still interesting the way that like the creature quality affects, you know, the things that I wish were there. So it's not even just the big flashy things, because I've gotten big flashy things, right? This time last year, I got Forsaken Monument into the cube, which like from this cube is like, it's Mirari's Wake ++.
Yes.
In a way that's like super weird and interesting and a very, very high pick in the cube and can do busted things. So there are these sort of like higher power nuggets that still come in, but it is, you know, the balance of it is still an interesting thing. Yeah.
Sure.
I now have a little meme I've cooked up for myself, which is just the art for that card. And whenever I see a spoiler for something that I really wish was colorless, if it's an artifact, and it just says another tragic victim of the war on colorless, I like to have a good little image of the monument behind it, just like, never forget.
Never forget. I know, because it looks like a sad. It looks like a sad, like giant or something.
Yeah, it's a sad Ulamog, right?
It's a sad Ulamog? Okay.
It's like a calcified Ulamog's crusher or something, right? That just is asleep and is dead and, was burnt up to a crisp or whatever when the Titans died, and that's what's left over.
Right.
So, yeah. I'm like the only person who's getting excited about, like, 2/2s for 2 and colorless, right? Like, I remember in Strixhaven where I didn't get many cards, but one of the cards that I got was Campus Guide, and I'm like, is that a Goblin Piker that fixes colors? That card's broken.
Yeah, it's really good in your cube.
I'm like, this is the only environment where anyone is excited about that card.
I know, like those cards, it's like Loam Larva, right? But it's like, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Search life for a basic, put land, put shuffle library, put it on top.
Yeah. And if you want color fixing, that's actually a pretty good card.
Right?
Yeah.
All right. So why don't we use this to transition to because we've been following the questions actually, like, pretty intuitively, but
yeah.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about big picture stuff on the cube. So overall goals, intended gameplay, all your big picture ideas about the design space.
Sure.
And then the follow up question is, where is the fun in the cube?
Yeah. All great questions. So, overarching restrictions, just for people who are new to the cube. Every card in the cube, except for one, is colorless, because technically Eldrazi Eldrazi Monstrosity is colored until it's in play. The only basic lands you can freely add to your deck are wastes. So there are cards with colored pips throughout the cube, but you have to draft colored sources in order to access them. There are 2 of each basic land, 1 snow, 1 regular, in the draftable pool. So if you want to draft cards with colored mana costs, or cards with abilities that have colored mana costs, you have to sort of work your draft a bit around them. And yeah, it's interesting. So overall goals. Recognizable archetypes was a huge one for me. When I went into it, especially with the starting point of the cube being like, this person has sort of put together a list that is quite basic as sort of a thought experiment. So really pushing that one further. Are there real archetypes? How do they show up? How do they play? How are they different from other things that are going on?
Right.
How do you differentiate those so that it actually, feels like cube? In that you have a variety of different options and ways you can go.
Yeah.
In terms of where the fun is, I think for me, the way I conceptualize cube is as two types of experiences that sort of go into it, right? There's a draft experience, and then there's a play experience. And I think, a draft experience, you want it to be interesting. Like, you want players to have to think during the draft experience. You want it to be exciting, where they're, each new pack has a card for them that, like, oh my god, like, this fits my deck, this is what I want to do. You want there to be some amount of tension so that, the draft is not entirely on rails, where it's immediately obvious what card I'm going to take out of every pack. The draft experience for this is just bananas. And that is very much part of the design, is like having to totally change your frame of reference for, like, what pick do I take here? There are not very many formats where you have to draft basic lands if you want to cast spells that have colors in them. You can completely ignore colors. You can go 5 color. Like, it's a very wild draft experience for the kind of cube that it is. And, like, that is very much the design. The gameplay, I think, for me, has a lot of risks inherent in it. So a lot of times when people look at the cube, they're like, you don't have power, you don't have soul ring, you don't have mana crypt, like, why not put in fast mana? And it's because there's very little interaction in the cube. Just there aren't that many colorless cards that interact on rate. And so you have to really balance, like, how good a threat someone can get out, understanding that they can't manage that, right? If you're in Vintage Cube and someone goes, turn one, Tinker, Blightsteel, Soul Ring, Mox, Tinker, Blightsteel, go. The other player can go like turn one, Plains, Path, turn one, Plains, Swords, right? And like the game's not over, and it's going to happen, and there are sort of these cheap answers to really high-end threats. That doesn't exist in the Devoid Cube. There are no super cheap answers to any threat, and the most direct answers tend to be expensive or colored, which means that you're less, depending on how well your deck comes together, you may or may not be ready when that happens. Sorry, my monitor went down. But regardless, I'll just keep talking.
Okay.
That's sort of like an interesting piece of it. So when it comes to gameplay, I want games to play out kind of similarly where people have a chance to execute their agenda, but I wanted them to be able to do things in recognizable archetypes, right? So I love that there is an all-in combo deck in my cube in the KCI combo. All of the pieces to execute the infinite KCI loop that powered the deck in Modern when it was legal, all of that stuff is still in the cube. You can literally draft that entire deck. I had someone draft an alternative version of that deck where they were able to execute the loop, but they didn't have anything to do with it. But they had a 4-drop Eldrazi creature that was whenever you play a colorless spell, your opponent exiles the top card of their library. And they literally just did the loop until their opponent, it was literally just the kill condition.
Right.
On that. So I love that exists. I love that low curve aggro is as good, it's as good as being the fun police in this cube as it is being the fun police in, that mono red or mono white is in sort of vintage cube, where you can build really, really powerful, aggressive decks that just come out of the gate too fast for people to deal with. The lack of interaction means that I need to be thoughtful about sort of how powerful those things are. But it's sort of kind of similar to mono red and mono white, where like if there's only one person at the table drafting it, it is going to be very fast.
It's going to be
very hard.
Yes.
Yeah, it's going to be very hard for other people to win. Once you have two people splitting the deck, the power level definitely comes way, way, way down, and the win rate comes way, way, way down. Because you just don't have all of the pieces in order to make that happen. So that is one of the things that I think works really well about the cube. There's ramp. Control, I think, is kind of the one archetype that's a little bit not as fleshed out as I would like it to be. It's very, there are rafts in the format. There are sort of, Oblivion Stone type effects that you can do, but it's hard to have a true sort of hard control deck. It's still very kind of like permanent and tap out based.
Yeah.
All of those sorts of things.
Yeah, the cube seems to all lean towards, like, all the archetypes seem to, like, be different speeds or, like, different, like, not different speeds of it, but, like, they're all kind of, like, big game decks. Like, they all just, like, are creating a machine or, like, building out a board to, like, there are sweepers and, like, board control and stuff, but, like, so far in my experience, all the decks are kind of trying to build, like, an overwhelming board position. In some way or another, either in the beginning of the game or the end of the game.
Yes, I think that's accurate, and I think the mid-range decks definitely start to trend a little bit more towards like battle cruiser kind of magic. Yeah. And like, I don't think that. I think most players have seemed to be okay with that kind of fun. Like if the game is ending because like one person's Eldrazi is bigger than the other person's Eldrazi, like. Everyone kind of got to do their thing.
Yes.
I've definitely been like, hi, I have like World Breaker and like am exiling someone's stuff, and then it's like Ulamog comes down or Kozilek comes down, and suddenly it's like, well, that was bigger than what I was doing. And so you can kind of have those swings coming through. But I don't know, people build crazy engine decks. Like the last time, I remember I had a new drafter who built a deck who killed me with Thopter Assembly. Like, he killed me from 7 life with Thopter Assembly and Blasting Station when his Thopter Assembly left, and he just got 6 5 or 6 triggers for all of his new Thopters coming in. It's just like ping you, ping you, ping you, ping you, ping you, ping you, you're dead. I'm like, just there's so many weird interactions in this cube. My favorite one that a player discovered was Soul of New Phyrexia plus Navinral's Disc. Navinral's Disc does not sacrifice itself. It simply destroys all artifacts in play. So if you have a live Soul of New Phyrexia and you can activate it and then activate a disc, you're just essentially ruinous ultimatuming your opponent every turn, and that tends to lock up the game.
Yeah.
Austin, I have never seen anyone play Lore Seeker as just a 2-mana 2/2. You probably could. I think that Deal Broker is one of the cards that does tend to actually get played for its abilities more than its Draft Matters abilities, just because like looting is an odd thing, and a 2/3 for 3 looter is actually like quite fine in the format. But I don't think I've ever seen anyone main deck Cogwork Librarian, Agent of Acquisitions, or Lore Seeker. But I've definitely also main decked worse cards in playing aggro decks. So like, if I had the Lore Seeker and I was playing aggro, I might play it. Yeah,
like a 2-mana 2/2 is totally fine in the format. Like if you're the aggressive deck. Yeah. So, yeah, it's kind of like, from what I've played and from what it sounds like, there are ways to like do, like there's a lot of ways to do really crazy things in the cube. I haven't actually explored that much of that yet. I probably should next time I draft it. Like try to do something really like offbeat, because I always end up just wanting to draft Arcbound Ravager decks. Look, part of that is like because I like being aggressive, but also the other part is like I just never really got to play with like what's the name of the mechanic that's designed around?
Arcbound or Affinity?
The Arcbound stuff. Modular.
Yes. Modular,
yeah. I never got to like play with decks that do modular stuff, so all that stuff is like really mechanically interesting and fun to me. So that's like a big part of why I like drafting it too. But like,
the first time Ryan Sachs drafted my cube, he immediately drafted KCI, and his deck was so good, it's why I cut Karn the Great Creator, was just because like the ability of Karn to make his amazing deck not work meant that like, oh, this is just a terrible card. This is a horrible card for the environment. Yes, it's obscenely powerful, and like it will also be not obscenely powerful against any of the Eldrazi decks, but just it was so sad to see such a fun deck like crushed by that. I mean, I really love when people kind of put together the crazy things. I love that the 5-color deck exists. That was for the first, until Modern Horizons 1, the cube was only 270 cards, because I was very, very particular about power balancing. And I really wanted to like have a very narrow span of kind of the power level of the cube. And after kind of Modern Horizons 1, it felt like enough things had happened that 5-color could really kind of be viable as an archetype. And then we got Golos and Field of the Dead, and it was very obvious that 5-color could be, 5-color and Lands Matter could be an interesting sort of an archetype. And so that all helped, right? Golos, well, from a design perspective, stop making the engine cards that fuel their own engine, where they're both the piece and the payoff. But like from the perspective of this cube, Golos was a huge win for enabling that kind of archetype to exist.
Definitely. It like further bolstered like inevitability, as well as like making lands matter more. Like there was like a whole texture that added to the environment. Yeah, like a lot of the fun in this cube is like, if I could define it, would be like it scratches this like just sort of like mechanical itch where like people just tend to like look for these like really weird interactions between cards that they'll never really play with in other contexts. I think recontextualization of cards is one of my favorite things about the cube. We talk a lot for people who sort of drafted the first time. There's a card called Gremlin Mine,
which is a common from New Phyrexia that is a 1-mana artifact that has the ability, 1, sack Gremlin Mine, deal 4 damage to target artifact creature, or 1, sack Gremlin Mine, remove 4 counters from a non-artifact from a non-creature artifact. And this is one of the premium removal spells in the format, which is just like, this card wasn't playable in New Phyrexia like draft. It was like, probably shouldn't play this card in that format. And so designing a format where like, this is extremely high end premium removal is like my favorite thing about how weird this cube is.
Yeah.
Yeah. For sure.
For sure. Okay, so great. Let's move on to my next question, which is like a two-parter. So we'll start with the first one. What are some of your success stories in the time you've spent designing the cube? Like, what kind of like conceptual things have you like plotted out with the cube that have stayed since the cube's inception, that are like, or things that you've discovered that were like huge wins, like in the process of designing the cube?
Yeah, so I think the thing that I am most proud of is the pretty successful balance around colored cards. Most players want to take them or want to play them or find themselves in a place where it is better to build their deck with the ability to access colored mana than it is to not. And in this format, adding colors to your deck is kind of closer to splashing than anything else. You can, if you do really well and you're very aggressive about picking lands, it can be very, very easy. But I think to me, that's like one of the pieces that is so bizarre about the cube. And you know, it has felt like the right power level. Like you get good payoffs when you're able to sort of be in colors. You know, the number of games that have been won with an Eldrazi Obligator, taking something absolutely outrageous and just beating someone to death with this threat and effect that otherwise, you know, they wouldn't have been able to have access to. Like, there's a lot of things like that in the cube that I'm really proud of. I think the overall power level, just in general, has kept in a place where there have been very few obvious things that are just absolutely wrong. Karn the Great Creator was one. You know, it's always exciting whenever we get new Planeswalkers because we don't get them that often.
Yes.
And so, you know, adding the Great Creator in, it's like, oh my god, it does all these things. He pulls stuff from the sideboard, and it became very clear that that card was busted. But at the same time, like, Ancient Tomb has survived since the beginning. You know, Skull Clamp has survived since the beginning. You know, Cranial Plating, all the cards, you'd be like, this must be patently insane in here. Smuggler's Copter, like, they are the top tier cards for sure.
Yeah.
They're the first picks, pretty obviously. Even Tower of the Magistrate, which is like, you know, many people who've sort of talked about this cube or looked at this cube have correctly identified that card is absolutely insane. Has not been so like overwhelmingly unfair that people, you know, can't win games against it or any of those other things.
And in case people want to know what this card is, it is tap for a colorless or 1-tap, target creature gains protection from artifacts until end of turn, which is both like Rogue's Passage and Brave the Elements in like one card.
I mean, it's a Mother of Runes that you can't interact with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it's a Mother of Runes that costs 1 mana and cannot be killed. Yeah. Except via, you know, some sort of either expensive destruction spell or one of the very few land destruction lands in the cube.
Okay.
It's absolutely, I mean, it is an incredible card. A lot of people have recently become familiar with it because I think Game Nights talked about it as like a big EDH tech card, and its price tag just went through the fucking roof. But so now I think a lot of people are more familiar with it. It was a kind of a throwaway rare from Masks Block, which is where I think a lot of apparently powerful EDH cards, you know, found some value.
Yeah, for real.
In sort of weird mechanics from Masks Block. But yeah, it's an absolute powerhouse. I haven't had to make many cuts based on power, even for cards that are simply and patently broken in almost any cube environment.
So would you say that, like, so most of the design process has been like because the design space is so focused, narrow, like whatever you want to call it, that like there's not a lot of there's not a lot of room for like getting big picture archetypes wrong. It's like more about like refining them and finding out where the best play, the gameplay comes from.
Yeah, as well as periodically reevaluating for when something that has been on the edge is now going to be viable. So kind of like what I did with the multicolor cards, right? Like Sunburst had always existed. There had been some other sort of 5-color things that had existed, right? So you have Etched Oracle, which is the Sunburst draw 3 cards.
Yeah.
And then you have Etched Monstrosity, Immured and Besieged. And so there had been these sprinklings. And so periodically, as there's sort of critical mass of different types of effects, recognizing like, are there enough of those now where I can go back and make this work? And so, and really sort of like identifying and paying attention to that. Yeah, Austin, the swords of X and Y were definitely an inclusion that it took me a while to sort of realize that they would be perfectly playable in this cube, because they lacked the traditional annoyance of being very, the annoyance on one player's side of like, am I going to pay 3 mana for this thing and then 2 to equip it, and then maybe I hit with it, and then how much have I paid and how much value am I getting, versus the chance that someone's just going to blow me out and kill the creature. It also removes the frustration of, well, now this creature has pro my deck, so I guess I'm going to lose if I don't find artifact removal.
Yeah.
And so it really kind of, like, they do give enough advantage that they're really worth, like, playing and equipping, or if you get them, putting them on an evasive creature and letting it go to town. But they kind of lose a lot of the downsides that people typically dislike the swords for. I'd say they probably get lower play than people would expect. I think it's really kind of the aggro decks tend to maybe play 1 or 2 of them as a top end thing. Or people sort of find that like, oh, I actually have a bunch of random flying creatures. Like I'm gonna play swords in that instance, so that there's enough evasion that this sword is really a worthy investment consistently.
Yeah, the first time I played your cube, and I was looking at Sword of Fire and Ice in a pack, and I'm staring at it, debating over whether I'm going to take it over something else, and then it dawns on me that I don't need, I'm like, wait, the protection isn't relevant in this cube, like it's just +2/+2, and I have whatever, Ghost Fireblade or whatever. That's just like so much more efficient for what I need it for.
It is, but there are all these weird corner cases. Like, I feel like I've lost games to sort of X and Y when like my only flying blocker was a mascot from mascot exhibition, and it's like, well, this creature is pro black now, so. And then you've lost that. Yeah, Ginger Brute, Ornithopter. Snarethopter? That's the 3/2 haste? Like, there are kind of some of these creatures, putting a sword on a Reality Smasher is not a sad day, when you can sort of do it by the trample route as well. So these things exist. There definitely are opportunities to do that. And play them.
It's interesting that like sometimes, and I noticed this when I was like, I've noticed this a couple times, is that like just basic combat stuff does really come up a lot more than I thought it would.
Yeah.
Which is nice, as somebody who really likes.
Which is kind of the virtue of being, such a permanent based format, right? Like in a lot of cubes, like, you have kind of those people playing tap out control or, very reactive control decks. And so, they're not really committing anything to the board, but they're answering threats quickly. A lot of times the only way to answer a threat in this cube is to put a blocker down and throw it in front of the threat. Yeah. So the math of combat and sort of figuring out what your attacks are and when you're going to block and when you're going to chump block kind of is much more a part of the cube than, traditional environments that have a lot of instant speed or spell-based interaction overall.
Yeah, like you can not engage with it, I think, but like that's because you're like putting together some kind of like engine with non-creature permanence or some combination of the two. Cool. It's really interesting to how much you have to recontextualize everything to make this successful. Okay, so conversely, the opposite of what I just asked. What kinds of things have had to change, and what hasn't worked, and what measures did you take to solve for it? And like what I mean, you could talk about individual cards, like Karn the Great Creator was like an example that came up a couple times. But I'm also interested in like, is there anything a little bit bigger than just individual card choices that had to get modified?
Yeah, so there are things that have tried to be in there and come and gone, and there are packages that I have sort of sitting waiting in the wings in case they're ever viable. Eldrazi Processors is a thing that I desperately want to work because there are a ton of fun, great colored Eldrazi creatures that have fun interactive abilities, but the enablers on the early end are just not good enough. You end up having to play really bad cards, and I think there are a lot of Cube designers who sort of realize, like, don't play bad cards to make your good cards good. Like, that's not a setup that you want to have. So that's one of those things where I'm very consistently trying to reevaluate and keep a track of, are there new, interesting, or powerful ways to exile things that will actually enable this archetype to become more viable. The challenge is that most of the early processors are also colored creatures, which means that your mana has to be really, really good if you're trying to play a colored 1 or 2 drop.
Right.
And by and large, it just sort of doesn't hold up.
Like,
and so there are a lot of, I think Sludge Crawler might be one.
Sludge Crawler, I just pulled it up,
is one.
Benthic Infiltrator.
Benthic Infiltrator. Mist Intruder was kind of like the big staple of that format, which is the 2 mana 1/2 that flies with Ingest. And there are a couple of ways to sort of exile things. So there are a few of these still in there, but there was a card called Blight Herder, which on rate is really kind of a pretty fun card for this cube. It's a 5 mana 4/5 that if you process successfully makes 3 1/1 scions. So it adds quite a bit to the board. It gives you a chance to generate potentially a very large amount of mana on the successive turn. There are a lot of things about this card that I really, really would love to get it back into the cube, but as just a 5 mana 4/5, it's not there. There are a couple of recent wins, like Unlicensed Hearse is like a generically powerful, good card that does some incidental exiling. I tried putting in a couple of package pieces like Bottled Cloister as a way to sort of like force some cards into exile. Fun fact, if you try and process a Bottled Cloister card, it's essentially just like a Hymn to Turok. Because you choose at random cards from their hand, like from their set-aside exile zone. So like it's some weird things happen there. Processors are a thing. I really love cheap decks. Like I love playing Reanimator in more powerful cubes. I love playing, whenever I would play kind of a Nexus Modern cube, one of my favorite things was always to try and draft Insane Luca decks, which were kind of a staple of her format. And so I have, Quicksilver Amulet, Thran, Temporal Gateway, a couple of these other cards sort of sitting on the side. But because of the lack of interaction, cheat decks are just not great for the environment. So I have kind of all of these pieces set, but I need something else in the environment to sort of give or change to get to a point where I feel like that's sort of a fair, viable, fun deck. Right now, sort of the biggest cheat deck is a very all-in KCI deck where you just sort of sack your board on turn 5, play a 10-drop, and pray that that's good enough. And that's, what's kind of fair here is if you have the answer to Kozilek, you have the answer to Kozilek, here we go. and that's sort of, fair and reasonable-ish, kind of in the grand scheme of the cube. Other things that have had to change. Something that hasn't had to change yet, but I'm very actively concerned on, is sort of the sameness of creatures and strategies. So if you look at all of the one-drop creatures now, there's a very definite trend of different types of Arcbound workers, right? So you have Arcbound Worker, you have Mere Scrappling, you have Iron Apprentice, where a lot of these cards are kind of doing the same thing. Now, in a cube environment, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? So for the people who are thinking about macro-based archetype design, the idea of having a bunch of interchangeable pieces is generally a good thing, right? Because your deck will consistently do the thing that you want your deck to do. The trade-off of that is, at some point, all the decks are sort of like are variations on interesting counters decks, and you sort of lose the texture of what's going on there. So there's stuff like that I'm sort of keeping an eye on and making sure that things don't become too samey around the experience of it. I haven't had to cut any of those creatures. I've been consistently adding those creatures because they are very good for the aggressive decks, even in their sort of different shades of it. With Arcbound Worker and Iron Apprentice being much better than Mere Scrappling, where you're not getting it sort of incidentally on the deck. Those sorts of things.
Iron Apprentice was a pretty significant upgrade from the previous ones.
Yes, and that one gets back to sort of the Arcbound Worker of it all, where you can move the counters around more significantly. Kamigawa was just an absolutely incredible set. I think I added like 14 new cards to the cube from there. They've started to potentially set up for an archetype I'm excited about, which is like Oops All Vehicles, with Neck Hanger as sort of a free way to crew things, where you don't necessarily have to have the creatures in play, or you can trade them off and whatever. There were some crazy upgrades. We got the Patchwork Automaton, which is a Patchwork Construct. The 2-mana 1/1 with Ward. Whenever you cast an artifact, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So I'm like, ooh, we got a Luminarch Aspirant in this cube.
This card is very powerful. Yeah.
Oh, very powerful.
Yeah, very powerful.
A very, very strong card.
Yeah.
And so whenever there's kind of these artifact sets, I think even as they rebalance, they are balancing cards that were like, we want this to be a strong, fun, limited build around. And I'm like, I have an Aspirant, I have a Tarmogoyf in my environment now. Like, that's amazing. Yeah. And just like the way that this cube is weird, like Boseiju is a colorless, top tier uncounterable removal spell. Yes. That is stronger than Path because it can't find waste. Just my favorite thing about it is they tried to make it really fair so that if they Boseiju your stuff, you can find any land with a basic land type. You can get a shock, you can get a duel. It's very reasonable. And then you look at waste and you're like, this doesn't have a basic land type.
It does not.
So they have to have drafted a basic in order for the Boseiju to not just be straight up Doomblade.
Doomblade. Or just Vindicate, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, it's somewhere in between because it can't hit Eldrazi, so there is this like subsection of things that it just can't hit. But it does have a very high level of versatility across the cube. Infect is another thing that was more heavily represented when the cube first, in the first iteration of it, and it just there was never quite enough critical mass to get to it. There certainly can be infect kills. Many people have died to either one hit off an Ichorclaw Mirror or something similar, and then found a way to sort of proliferate the game to the end, usually via Contagion Engine. People have definitely gone all in on Inkmoth Nexus in the past, so there's still bits and pieces of it present. I don't think we're ever going to get more colorless infect creatures. It would be very surprising to me if that were a thing that happened, but it's definitely something that I would welcome. in the event that it did. I think that would be like a fun kind of goofy combo archetype, and also one I'd have to be very diligent about managing the power level of when you have so many things like, you know, cranial plating and, you know, grafted war gear and these things that really make your infect creatures like, you know, 10 power equivalent very quickly. You know, there's stuff to sort of keep an eye on there. It might end up being too powerful, but you know, Infect was one of those decks that you sort of draft as a fun puzzle in the format that they're in. As, you know, once you're doing the full block, it was like, okay, I'm going to be in green X Infect, and Infect might be white, it might be red, it might be blue, it might be black. And I'm sort of going to try and back into it. And like, I loved playing Infect in that format. So in you know, certainly in Triple Scars, I loved Infect. That was the most fun. But it became a more interesting puzzle as the format evolved. And you started adding in more interesting kind of like colors and things. So Infect is something I would love to see kind of come back, but would have to be really, really tightly managed to make sure it doesn't sort of spiral out of control.
We have what, Merchant of the Machines ×2 coming soon? Yeah.
I mean, I think that there are a couple. Energy was actually another archetype that was in here for quite some time. Aetherworks Marvel could definitely do some insane things. You had both of the puzzle knots that would grant you energy.
Yeah.
I had Deadlock Trap in here for a bit that was sort of doing a tumble magnet impression, things like that. It just, there was never quite a consistent enough way to generate energy that really sort of like worked. Every once in a while you could sort of get a deck that could consistently spin a Marvel, but you know, it could never consistently spin a Marvel twice, right? So you really had to hit on that Marvel and it really needed to be big. And that led to just kind of like a bunch of whiffs. I think that Energy and potentially also Infect are probably mechanics that, if they were to be explored, are more likely to be explored in a Commander product. As just sort of like, hey, we're back in New Phyrexia, some people like Infect, let's spin up an Infect-based Commander deck and just kind of like see how that goes. You know, we're going back to Kaladesh at some point, like let's, you know, add a whole bunch of funky energy cards that sort of fit the aesthetic of this. You know, we're obviously not going back to Kaladesh for at least the next year. You know, who knows when we will. But the interesting. Through Rider House rules on Chaos Orb. I generally ask players at the beginning of the draft how they want to do it. We split between it's simply Vindicate and someone who genuinely wants to do all the flipping. You know, at CubeCon, it will have to be according to the traditional rules of Magic. So there will probably be a fun mini game of let's check out and see who has the Chaos Orb, so I know how to arrange my board against that player. And you know, people will have to get their flips in to sort of practice. So typically, I think most players tend to want to just sort of play it as a clear Vindicate. But CubeCon, it will be, you know, according to the official Oracle text of that card. So everyone can get excited about that.
I noticed there's no, like, well, maybe I'm missing it. Like Ichor Wellspring kind of cards?
Yeah, there aren't a ton of, there's not a ton of, like, really strong sack things.
Yeah.
Where like where you kind of like get a ton of value, or you have sort of consistent ways to sort of sack them, where you would rather play sort of an Ichor Wellspring type thing. We've gotten some closer things like Spare Supplies is like yeah. gets kind of close to being sort of almost like a think twice in the format.
Yeah.
But there isn't sort of like, you know, there's Archon Ravager and things like that, but at that point you're not jamming Ichor Wellspring into your deck because you have one Archon Ravager. That's an archetype that I love and there's not sort of a good way to put together. It's sort of a an aristocrat style deck. That's something that's very much on my list. We don't have a colorless blood artist of any kind.
Yeah.
We came so close, and they just switched it on me, which was in Zendikar, the most recent Zendikar
Rising. Yeah.
Zendikar Rising. There were the party-based artifacts for each of the things. So there was the 6-mana golem that cares about being milled for rogues. There was the axe that auto-equips to warriors.
Yeah.
There was Relic Vial, Austin is totally on it, which had the ability to sacrifice a creature, draw a card, and then the text, if you control a cleric, drain one whenever a creature dies, or maybe one of your creatures dies. Which, if they had reversed it, where if whenever a creature dies, you drain one, and then if you control a cleric, you sort of get this sack activation.
Right.
That would have been I would have been absolutely building around that.
Yeah.
Seriously. As a thing that I love. Sadly, I think and probably correctly for the balancing of their limited format, it was formatted the other way, and so I did not get a Bastion of Remembrance, sort of tier card for this cube.
Yeah, because then you can
one day maybe.
Then you can play cards like Servo Schematic and shit.
Exactly, Servo Schematic, Cogworkers Puzzle Knot,
Cogworkers Puzzle Knot,
Ichor Wellspring, all of those sorts of things. Where if there's that sort of a thing. I'm excited about New Karn. I'm excited about New Karn ultimating into an Aether Grid. And I think that's an exciting thing to be able to build towards. I think it's a good card advantage engine, even if people aren't super excited about it. Hopefully that just pushes the price down a little bit.
Are you gonna play Thran? Are you gonna play Thran Portal? Or do you not need more of this?
I'm not planning on it. I know.
Okay.
I feel that the rainbow deck right now is almost a little bit too easy.
Okay.
I think if there's going to be a pullback, it's going to be in the efficiency of that deck.
Okay.
What that pullback looks like, I'm not entirely sure, but I feel like that deck is coming together a little bit more easily than I would like it to. Yeah, I mean, I don't have City of Brass or Mana Confluence because I consider them a little bit too easy. In the original design, like the very first design, there was sort of a headcanon, like a lore-based headcanon, which is like, this cube is what happens when the Eldrazi win, right? Like, all the colors sucked out of everything, and then there's like, there's one forest remaining, there's one swamp remaining, there's one mountain remaining. So if you want pure mana, it's coming from there, and otherwise all other sources of mana would be breakable. So like egg style, you have to sack it to get it, Chromatic Sphere, Chromatic Star. It would require energy in to get energy out. So sort of like the storage lands from the Time Spiral block, or it would be painful. And so that would be either pain lands or the Horizon lands. I, as with many cubes, am very much looking forward to the finishing the set of the Horizon lands, at which point I would actually fully cycle pain lands out of the cube, because I want the payment of life using those lands to be mandatory, so that there is a bigger cost to sort of playing colors.
Sure.
Which right now the pain lands really are free rolls because they have great colors. So I have sort of thoughts and plans around some of those things. Also, not having to get foil 7th edition pain lands would be very nice.
That would be very nice. Yes.
Not a thing I'm trying to do.
That would be a very that would not that would add so much stress. I was almost at that point too before I went all duels, which I guess is its own problem. But my God, they might as well be the price of dual lands at this point.
Yeah. Like a foil Underground River is the price of is more than a revised Underground Sea.
Probably at this point, yeah.
No, not probably. Like,
not probably.
I can tell you that for a fact. Like,
like
a mint a mint 7th edition foil Underground River is over $1,000.
Wow. We have pre-modern to thank for that as well.
I mean, 7th edition foils have always been, and now it's when there was the proliferation of costs associated with old border foils. Yeah, see, the regular one's not so bad. The foils, though, the foils are real money.
I mean, somebody literally bought one on the 19th, you know?
Yeah.
For $653.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Near mint?
Near mint.
No. Well, they're not as high as I thought they were, but it's still about the price of
It's about the price of an Underground C.
Of like an MP revised Underground C. So we can all be prepared for that. Yeah. No, I got in on Old Border right before Old Border went insane. So like I got my my foil Memory Jar, my foil Masticore, like my foil Tangle Wire, all when they were each sub 200. Some of them way sub 200. So it's been crazy, kind of seeing the prices, but
so it is.
Yeah.
Hi, Zach. How are you?
Yes, Cs have dropped. A lot of the duels have dropped. There's a huge spike in the beginning of the pandemic. Hypotheses for that are essentially people cashed out crypto to buy into Magic, and also people had extra walking around money. For people who were able to get, enhanced benefits from the administration at the time, which was a good thing, and everyone should have. But it definitely led to a bit of frothiness kind of in the market. I am very lucky that I got in before some of that frothiness. I have paid for not getting ahead of enough of that frothiness. So.
Yeah, there are a couple cards that I did not pick up that I very much regret. But conversely, there are cards that I picked up during that have like tripled in price. So I guess it all comes out in the wash at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was a big Reddit post of that guy that cashed out of crypto for like $100,000. He went to Vegas in 2019 and he bought 40 revised duels, 40 underground, or 40 unlimited duels, and 40 alpha beta duels. Do you remember that? And he scanned all of them and posted on Reddit.
I do not remember that. But
that was like a big that was a big finance story around that.
Sure.
Like around that time, it was pretty wild. I was at that GP and I did not know this was happening, and I was talking to people that ran booths that would have picked up on this. It was I don't know. It was a weird.
I follow the finance side of things. I find it interesting. I don't do anything, MTG finance related. Like, I go to shows, I vendor my cards, I get the cards I want. Like, I feel like Cube has actually been really great for establishing a healthy interaction with Magic and just sort of really framing what are the things that I enjoy about this hobby, what are the things that I enjoy about collecting, and then just giving me the freedom to not have to like FOMO. Like, I've never bought a collector's box. Every time a collector's box come out, I'm like, I want to buy a collector's box. Like, I love cracking packs, all that stuff.
Yep.
But like, I don't need it, and it doesn't fit. Like, I buy product to play with it with friends, and I buy the cards that I want for my cube. And now that, I will pay money for big expensive cards if I want them for my cube. And if I, draft with friends and I have cards left over, they will go into cards for the cube. And it's really nice to not feel like I have to FOMO or get involved in whatever the biggest, most insane new version of cards are, while still being able to be excited about the things I get excited about. Having a weird cube, having some sort of restriction on your cube makes spoiler season so much more fun. I find it's just you get to be so excited. What are the goodies? What are the things that I get? And even when it's not a ton of cards, like, it's always fun to just be like, that thing works for me, right? Yeah. I get Pernicious Deed is now on the menu for this cube, which is a thing that has not been in the past. It's going to give the cube the ability to have like a really consistent turn 4 wipe. Yeah, Thrill Rider. I mean, I look back now on like the way that I maintained my old cube, and I didn't try to make anything premium in my powered cube when I had it. But trying to keep up with like all of the prettiest versions of the chase cards, and all the different treatments and things, like, you know, a lot of people buy cards to test, and you know, you have to sort of decide, do I want to go long on this card? Is this card going to be super expensive? You know, if I miss now, you know, like I think a recent example is like the Wandering Emperor. Like the Wandering Emperor was a card that like looked pretty good on paper, but you know, the 4-drop white Planeswalker slot is a highly competitive one, and it wasn't immediately clear if the Wandering Emperor was going to be good enough to sort of displace things. And then like, you know, 3 weeks in, it's like, oh no, multi-format all-star, and suddenly the premium expensive version of that card was, you know, $150 or whatever.
It was more than that for a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where it's sitting now. I expect it's over 100, but less than 150. If I was going to guess, it's probably in the 130. The Gilded Rafine, when that came out, right, was people realized, oh, this is going to be a really fun commander to build around. It's going to be really, really expensive. I can't quite see that number. How bad is it?
Oh, it went down. I bought it. So all this talk of you being like, oh, I don't have to worry about all this, like chasing the new hot cards, and I don't, you know, I just get to look at it. Yeah, I'm like, you're literally describing me as the person that you don't have to be during spoiler season. And like I'm the one that had to shell out for for Sorin. Like I got like the fucking fancy Castlevania art Sorin. I get
the difference on my perspective is, do you enjoy that, or do you find that obnoxious and stressful?
I love it. Right? Like, I love it. So it doesn't
then it's
matter.
Not a problem.
Yeah.
Then you know, as long as that's your relationship with it, where it's healthy. Whereas I feel like if I had to do that for every card in a cube, or I was trying to do it, like I wouldn't be collecting in the same way. And I do love the insane investment I made in my Devoid Cube.
Yeah.
Like I had, for a very long time, sitting around in my binder, I had 8 of my 10 fetches, or 8 of my 10 duels from my original cube, because I didn't need anything that big, and I didn't know what to do with them. And this was before they spiked, so this was when my really beat up C was probably worth only $300 or whatever.
Yep.
And I sold them all to a friend, because he wanted them for EDH decks, and I wasn't doing anything with them. And I used the rest of that money to like foil out the Devoid Cube, to buy a bunch of like really terrible cards, you know. And some of those cards have managed to spike and be insane. Like I bought an Antiquities Trike because the bucket is hilarious. And you know, I got that for $40. They're now 150 or whatever they are, because everything in Four Horsemen is insane.
Yeah.
And so like I've benefited from each of the bad decisions that I've made is ultimately kind of how it's worked out for me. You know, I've definitely lost more than I've won, but like it all kind of like comes out in the rough wash. Austin, yes, I love. It's a little less common for the Devoid Cube because I'm going to get the most premium versions. It's less common that like a friend opens like the weird random foil that I need. But it is always like, that is one of the most fun things about spoiler season, is like when someone does that. So I experience that more in my other paper cube, which is my Evergreen Peasant cube, where like I do tend to need like a bunch of weird uncommons after each set that like no one really cares about. And I love sets like this where there's a bunch of interesting treatments for sort of lower power cards that I'm going to be able to sort of consider and add. I love that we're getting a promo Lightning Strike. I love that we're getting a promo Cut Down. Like they're really doing a good job of identifying and choosing really fun cards to fit in that sort of slot. Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate that, and it definitely enhances the way that I feel like I get to enjoy collecting. But I don't really like, I have a collection, so to speak, but really it's like I have my 2 cubes. I have like the maybe board for the Devoid Cube, and then I have a binder full of stuff that's going to go for other cards. You know, the next time I get out to a show, I haven't been to a Magic event since February 2020. CubeCon I don't think is going to have vendors. So I just, you know, I buy a Secret Lair if it has a card that I want in it, or I'm excited about. I might get 2 Secret Lairs out of this bunch. because the Contagion engine is pretty impressive and the Matter Reshaper is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
The Matter Reshaper will be cheap, the Contagion engine will be expensive, so I'm you know, kind of up in the air deciding. But I have just like a bunch of leftover things from different, like I got the Pride Lair, and the only card I wanted from it was a Mana Confluence, so which is in the Evergreen Cube, not the Devoid Cube. So like I have all these cards that like are just ready to go to a vendor, and if it ever amasses to the point where I can find like an MP Chaos Orb, then it'll go for a Beta Chaos Orb. Otherwise, I have a third cube that if I were ever to build it in paper, is the next paper cube I would build, and so the cards might just all get shipped to build that for $0.
What is that?
Or dollars I've already spent.
What is that?
It is my color shifted cube. So you can find it if you look on the rest of my cubes. I really like it as a concept. It's been an interesting one to maintain. It's the one that's Simeon's Spirit Guide, if you look on it. Yeah,
I got it.
It's the art. Yeah. It's just kind of like playing with the color pie and sort of looking at those effects that are tertiary in a color, with the exception of black, which doesn't have any tertiary effects. Black can do anything it wants all the time as long as it's willing to pay life for it. So black had to get really weird. But sort of the rest of the design I really love. Every once in a while there's sort of stuff that sort of like comes together and really fits well for it. So like it was when Strixhaven came out, it was very, very weird, because like Lorehold was just my Boros section. And so it had a lot of things in there, and there was a lot of potential options that sort of came out of that. But that's a cube that has a lot of really weird, interesting design things associated with it. But another time, another podcast, the next CubeCon, I'll write in paper.
So the last thing I wanted to go over was you have this wonderful draft guide for your cube. I wanted to go over that because the last thing on my list is let's go over the archetypes. And you just so happen to have a draft guide for your archetypes, so it works out perfectly. I am going to go get some water real quick.
Excellent.
It will be like 30 seconds, so I'll be right back. And I'm going to eat some chocolate while I do that.
If anyone has random questions in the chat, I'm happy to try and answer anything else that the folks want. It can be cube related, it can be Devoid Cube related, it can be anything else. Thrill Rider, I love the fact that Collector's Boosters have made so many cards accessible. One of the other cube projects that I work on is what I have decided to describe as my cheap cube. It's trying to just be the most cube-like feeling experience at the lowest possible price point. I made the mistake of updating it after the
Weathered Sentinels. What are that?
2XM. Oh, Weathered Sentinels is on a very serious watch list. It's the true name nemesis of the format. It is a stupid EDH card that is not at all balanced for 1v1 play and is not at all balanced for this cube. I think it gets like one more round, and if it is equally problematic, it will get cut due to power. As the only 3-mana wall that I think that's ever going to be said about from a cube perspective.
This is awful. Oh my god.
Yeah.
So it's a 3-mana, 2/5 Defender, Vigilance, Reach, Trample. And if your opponent attacks you, it becomes you can attack it as a 5/7, right? With Indestructible.
Yeah. An indestructible 5/7 with Vigilance and Trample. Like, it is so dumb how outrageous. Yeah, 5/8. It's so strong, and it is literally just like True Name Nemesis. Like, what are you gonna do about it? Your only option is wait for me to win, or try and race me, and then I will win, because this thing is enormous and can block for days.
Yeah, also, Vigilance Reach is so obnoxious.
Yeah, like perfectly balanced for a 4-player EDH game. Like the strong but fine, whatever. But 1v1, it's you really have to have like you have to have something that has 8 power or more to sort of deal with it. Or you get like an O-Stone or an engineered explosive, ratchet bomb, those sorts of things will resolve it. But
right.
I think that the gameplay it leads to is maybe very problematic for the cube.
It's kind of like if you attack me, you come at the kid, you best not miss. Kind of card.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's like you need to have a cranial plating and a plan. Like if you're gonna try and race me, like it needs to be very big on the front end, and otherwise, like we're gonna race, and this will block any of your small things.
Gross.
Yeah, it is. It's very gross. So we're gonna see if it sort of holds that spot and kind of ruins another set of rounds. I don't think it necessarily ruined Zach's game, but it made attacking very not fun, and it made like the game slow down a lot in a way that I'm not sure is good for the environment. But,
right. It's just a net negative on the fun scale.
Yeah.
Yeah. It didn't ruin the game. Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably just added a lot of complexity to.
Well, I think it helped that the matchup in which it kind of came out and did the thing was kind of two mid-range to top-end haymaker kind of decks. So, like, the fact that it sort of slowed that down and let both players kind of enact their game plan was fine. But to the point that Zach just made, like, that card against, a bunch of Goblin Pikers, that is going to do more work than I think I intended to in that matchup.
That's no fun. Yeah, that's hyper polarizing. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right. Like the deck that's a bunch of Goblin Pikers is going to need a ton of insane equipment or something like a Skull Clamp where it can just sort of try and grind out value against it in order to try and do it. And that doesn't account even for the fact that like they get to crack you back for 5 with Trample with Vigilance.
And
yeah. So it's I mean Indestructible is great, but it matters a little less in this cube because like being a 5/8 it's hard to block profitably against a 5/8,
sure.
Let alone the Indestructible type.
Yes.
So yeah, good question. It's a real thing.
Zach's just knowing how early he should be taking it on the next draft, I guess.
I mean, potentially, but I mean, it would fit very well in the types of decks that Zach likes to play, which is at least 3 colors.
Yes, the goal. You just like give him Golos and Field of the Dead. And,
I like playing like Sultai Control. Honestly, is like one of my favorite things to sort of draft in the cube, which is an insane thing to love in a Devoid Cube. Sniffy Gull, who's sort of a Twitter mutual, I think of many of us. He was in the one Roto draft I did of this cube, and he immediately went for Jund Control. Like he was that was the thing he wanted to play, and he just like took all the lands and then all the red cards, and his deck was amazing. He had a deck that was like consistently proccing Kozilek's Return on the back half of the card, and he was getting full value from it. I remember there was one game where like Gwen had essentially locked the thing up. Like his board was insane, and the only out was like casting a 7-drop creature to get a Kozilek's Return trigger. Like Drew happened, won, and it was so brutal. It was such a cool deck.
Wow.
And with the Seiju, that deck's only gotten a little bit better. Yeah.
Okay, let's go over some archetypes, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like there's like the way that I tend to think about it is like there's archetypes, and then many of the archetypes then have sort of like a colored flavor version of that archetype, which is a little bit different and gives them sort of access to different cards. So I'd say like, the first and most obvious archetype is sort of red. right? So get a bunch of, whether it's mana mirror, 2 mana rocks, Worn Power Stone, those sorts of things, a Palladium mirror, generate a bunch of mana, play a bunch of threats very, very quickly, sort of outsized. So that, that one is straightforward. That's an archetype that exists in many cubes.
Yeah.
Instead of, mana elves, it's mana mirror. Instead of, but honestly, even a lot of the rocks kind of stay the same. That deck has a ton of different flavors. There's the green flavor of that deck, where you get access to a lot of the high quality artifact destruction. So that gives you access to your Mockery of Nature. It gives you access to World Breaker, which is like one of the premium kind of threats. It gives you, so I have sort of jumped quite a bit to that. So there's the green flavor of that. There's the blue flavor of that, which is where you get access to things like Elder Deep Fiend, Drowner of Sorrow, Memnarch, all of those sorts of things. So you do tend to see sort of a Simic bent in the big color ramp. There's also, just the straight 5-color version of ramp that can be a little bit more lens mattery, that sort of thing. We can scroll up and sort of take these in order, so it's a little less. Sure, yeah. Off my head.
So, Affinity Aggro is the first one.
Yeah. So Affinity Aggro is just, it is the mono red of the format, right? You're trying to play cheap, efficient creatures, usually buffing them with highly efficient equipment, and just trying to end the game as fast as possible. Affinity Aggro, I think all of the aggro decks, to me, can have a red flavor to them. The red flavor gives you access to actual direct damage and burn from Ghostfire or Touch of the Void. They give you access to some of the higher power, low drop Eldrazi creatures in Vile Aggregate and Eldrazi Obligator, which can really just be quite massive haymakers. The low curve Affinity Aggro deck can also have more of a counters flavor, where you sort of have, whether it's Ravager, Steel Overseer, the Ozolith, a bunch of those sorts of cards that sort of make the it be a little bit more of sort of a synergy kind of deck, but also has kind of sometimes even all-in sort of combo potential. All of those are sort of different flavors of the Affinity Aggro deck. And I think is one of the stronger decks if it's not split across multiple players.
Yes, it feels like something between Hardened Scales and like a traditional Mox Opal Affinity.
Very much so.
Super powerful when it's when you get all the pieces. But also if you just get some of the outliers, like the deck also just has like a ton of staying power too. I remember I had Urza Saga, Ghost Fireblade, and like that, like stuff like that was just that kind of carried a lot of games for me.
Yeah, it's probably I should probably update the absolute top tier cards to include Urza Saga, because that thing is just very powerful in the environment.
Such a house.
It's a very, very strong card. So we have Affinity Aggro, we have Counters Matter. Roll down to the next one. Eldrazi, I think of as sort of, there's like aggro Eldrazi, there's like mid-range Eldrazi, and then there's Eldrazi as a flavor of ramp. So the aggro Eldrazi deck is trying to play outsized Eldrazi threats early and quick. This is a deck that is much more excited about like Reality Smasher, Endless One, Eldrazi Mimic, Matter Reshaper, sort of all of the Eldrazi. This is a deck that wants Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple as sort of the soul lands to really help you aggressively get out early. Yes. And the Eldrazi cards are just all big for kind of where they sit on the curve. As I said, on the aggro side, the red Eldrazi sort of help quite a bit with the sort of the more aggressive bent to the deck. So that's kind of like the aggro version of Eldrazi. There's then sort of what I'd say is sort of the mid-range version of Eldrazi, This is where you're really caring more about casting your 6 drops than, you know, sort of topping out your curve around 5. So this is where you're probably playing things like Endbringer is kind of like one of the really powerful finishers in that deck. Oblivion Sower is one of the really big value generators and just is an enormous body in that deck, where you're not necessarily trying to get to a place where you're casting Ulamog or Kozilek or Emrakul the Promised End, which tends to be about a 10 drop still in the cube. You can really try and build your deck well to get it lower, but it is hard to do.
Okay.
So that's kind of like the flavor. And then the third is just Eldrazi as huge ramp. You know, this is where you're hard casting your Ulamogs and your Kozileks and those sorts of things. So there's kind of these 3 different flavors of Eldrazi.
What's Juggernaut Tribal?
Juggernaut Tribal is essentially my affectionate term for oversized 4 and 5 drops. So there are a lot of 2 mana accelerants. So ways to go from, you know, 2 mana on turn 3 to 4 mana on turn 4. And there are just a bunch of really powerful, outsized 4-drop creatures.
Yeah.
And some of them are Juggernaut, like are officially Juggernauts. Some of them, you know, I just sort of say are. So like Traxos is kind of one of the big heavy hitters in this. Weaponized Scrapped, which is a playtest card, is a very, very strong creature. And you can sort of put it over another artifact and just sort of go to town. Galvanic Juggernaut fits into this. Regular Juggernaut kind of fits into this. Walker of the Waste is a card that is very good if you're kind of able to be purely colorless and play a large number of wastes.
Right.
You know, it's a great way to have a 5 mana, you know, 9/9 Trampler on turn 5. And so, like Precursor Golem sort of fits into this, where it's really about powering out to really efficient, scary mid-range threats, kind of as fast as you can, but not really worrying about any of the like tribal synergies or going anything like that. Yeah. I really like this deck, and I think that it's kind of like a good definition of like what true mid-range in this cube looks like.
Yeah.
And I think of it as kind of, you know, Juggernaut Tribal, like, is sort of the way that I conceptualize it.
I call them like just chonky creatures.
Yeah, like Lodestone Golem, like your Juggernaut, like I know you're technically, but all of those sorts of things sort of line up.
Sweet.
So then I think like, go ahead.
I was gonna say we talked about Eldrazi ramp, basically, just how big it can go.
Yeah.
And then the next thing on the list is, we talked about big mana ramp as well.
Yeah,
right?
I kind of started there.
Yeah.
So 5-color Field of the Dead. This is essentially the deck that, you know, as we say, wants to eat its vegetables. So really kind of aggressively taking lands early on to have colored sources, and then, you know, doing the traditional thing of wheeling your splashes, but being able to pick up kind of some of these high-value colored cards toward the end of the draft, right? Being able to cast Beseju, being able to cast Kozilek's Return, being able to cast, you know, Elder Deep Fiend, whatever it is, just really waiting for those cards to come around or come later in the pack because people don't have the ability to really play them. Obviously, Golos is a full package in and of itself. Field of the Dead works really well with this. Ryan Sachs is a huge complimenter of this cube, and I think he has posted pictures on his Twitter in the past of just his favorite mana base from any draft, any deck in any draft he's ever done, and it was when he did the full, 17, 18 different land Field of the Dead deck with this cube, and just like had an absolute blast. And that's like, I think for me, that's part of having an interesting draft experience, right? One of the things that also, Zach is very complimentary of in this cube is the ability of any deck to play a whole bunch of different utility lands. Because by and large, unless you're really, really going aggressively after color, they're strictly better than waste.
Yes.
If you're not playing a deck that sort of cares about that. And so, there are a lot of lands in the cube. I think it's like 17 or 18% of the overall size of the cube is lands. So, I have 100 foil wastes sitting in my land box, and I've never gotten close to using all of them in an 8-person draft. And so, the lands matter deck, you can kind of aggressively go after that. It tends to then morph into being the multicolor deck. I don't think I've ever seen a fully colorless lands matter deck, but it would probably be doable.
You were at, my friend, you were at 19.73% lands in your cube.
All right. Well, I'm getting very close to the
full 20%.
The full 20% as ordained by Lucky Paper, so I must be doing something right.
What did they say about 20% lands?
Oh, they just posted a thing recently. It was an article about like cubes don't have enough lands, and like lands add a lot of value and experience to sort of the draft, and therefore like people undervalue lands and should probably have more lands in their section. You'd love it if you didn't get a chance to read it.
Yeah, it sounds like something I might be interested in talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Subscribe to their newsletter.
Yeah.
The control deck is hard. It is hard to get to come together in the way that you want. It sort of, I think it has a decent fail case if you sort of can't get all the things you want. It has a lot of sort of permanent based effects like Icy Manipulator, or I have Ring of Gix in there, Tumble Magnet, the one from Amonkhet, the Monument from Amonkhet that sort of prevents creatures from attacking and ultimately attacking or blocking. A couple of these sort of like more interesting speed bump carriers in Perilous Mirror, which is now a Phyrexian Mirror. Some of the infected creatures are really intended more as sort of these anti-aggressive speed bumps. So like Necropede is a good example of kind of like a creature that is really meant to be much more on the defensive side. And then, it's sort of using board wipes to clear ways for haymakers. This is a cube where Platinum Angel Lightning Greaves is like kind of is a closer to hard lock than soft lock. And so there's sort of things like that can sort of play into the control deck. I tend to try and draft it. It does not, I don't think it overperforms, but it's nice when you can kind of get it into the space that you want it to be.
Sure.
And have those reset buttons.
I kind of feel like 5-color Field of the Dead is pretty close to control, or at least they like share a lot of the same like game plan, or maybe even the set of cards that they want.
Yeah, that's probably accurate. Like I think that there are definitely like the Lands Matter 5-color deck definitely wants the game to go longer so that they can sort of get the value out of the assembled colors that they have and that sort of a thing. So yeah, there's a bit of overlap. It is a bit of a control deck. I think of the control deck as the one deck that is trying to reserve overplaying permanents to the board. And that is kind of, I think, one of the challenges of it, is that tends to be more relevant to the cube. And it's hard to sort of have the right answers at the right time when it's, the density of answers is a bit lower.
Yes.
So it does tend to play, I think, a little bit more as like a conservative mid-range deck rather than like a pure like draw go or tap out control style deck.
Right.
But it does work out. And a lot of the cards are just like either good to have in sort of a mid-range type deck, or they're good to have. They're like good sideboard cards, right? So like if you are, Ratchet Bombs, and if you're a mid-range deck, like having access to Ratchet Bomb or Powder Keg is good for being up against the faster, more aggressive decks.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so now we have combo. We have the Ironworks combo deck.
Yeah.
Yep.
Ironworks combo deck. I love that it's in here. I love that it's viable. This is for whoever you are that loves drafting Storm and is going to do that regardless because Storm exists and like that's the plan.
Yeah.
I hope that you pack one, pick one Ironworks. Ironworks is enough of just like a crazy accelerant and value card that like someone will take it, someone will play it, and it's it is a sought after card in the cube. But boy, if you get to pack one, pick one, there's a lot of joy you can have in really assembling that. I should probably just have a direct link to a judge explaining how loops work and that sort of a thing, because it is definitely mind-boggling to truly understand all of those pieces.
Yes.
But yeah, Ironworks it's there for the people who love the thrill of that kind of a draft experience. I'm like, oh my god, this is it. Like, it's like when you open Yogg-Will and you're just like, or you open Time Spiral, and you're just like, well, if I'm not going to do it, who is?
Who is going to do it? Yeah, what I say about that is like, if you open Black Lotus in the Vintage Cube, you should probably just try and force Storm because that's like one of the most important pieces for the whole deck.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So if you find that, Scrap Trawler is also, it's not going to go late. It's a very good aggro card. It's a very good just value card.
Yeah.
So like you have to kind of lucky to pull all the pieces in. Yeah, Austin, I have clicked that link many times. It doesn't mean that I fully understand how this works.
Yeah, I mean,
and I certainly couldn't articulate it. But it helps that at least three of my most consistent drafters of this cube are all judges. And yeah, that's a whole explanation on that. So I think if we ever arrived at the loop, we would have someone who could help us articulate how it worked.
Well, there was even like a moment, I don't know if you remember, when Matt Nass was like smoking everybody in Modern with that deck, that he like was in the finals of a GP and had to ask a judge about a corner case that he found in the deck during the finals of a GP, which had to do with like, you can overpay for a spell. Like, you can announce the casting of the spell and then overpay it by sacking too many, like, more artifacts than is necessary to pay for the spell. And, like, he even, like, in the interview, he was like, yeah, I, like, found out something else that you could do with the deck today that I didn't realize was possible.
For sure.
Yeah, so, a little bit of complexity in that combo. But I think the last time I saw somebody do that, I was with Ferrando and Miles and Kanta, and we were playing Commander, and he has a Grenzo deck that uses KCI to win. And he assembled KCI, and all four of us sat there and figured out how he could get the win with the combo. And it's it takes a village sometimes.
Yeah. I think one of my favorite recent additions to the cube is Moonsilver Key from Innistrad Midnight Hunt. And the reason why it's my favorite addition is because it is such a bizarre set of things that it can tutor for.
Yes.
So it can tutor for any artifact with a mana ability. So what that means is this can fix your mana if it goes to find a artifact duel from Horizons 2. So it can go be multiple colors of mana. It is a direct tutor for KCI if you're doing that. And my favorite is it is a direct tutor for Forsaken Monument. Because the mana doubling ability on that counts as a mana ability.
Fascinating.
It's not sort of an activated mana ability, but it is a mana ability, which is all that the card asks for. And so this is now just like a very bizarro kind of like wacky tutor that helps bring a lot of value to some of the crazier, more combo or over the top oriented decks.
Weirdly worded card this is.
What a weird, and that is what I speak about when I talk about like the joy of this cube and sort of spoiler season, just being like, does this work? Like, what is happening? Like, and it does. That is the one expensive double feature foil that I have. The other two did not get more expensive, but this one I think has some EDH legs to it. And also, the double feature artifacts are all beautiful.
Yes, they're very beautiful.
they're really, really nice looking.
Yeah.
I mean, that looks like, some true terrifying horror nonsense. I love that. I love the aesthetics on this one. And I'm also playing like Silverbolt, which like everyone can be fine if I have my foil Silverbolt. No werewolves in the Devoid Cube yet.
That's not yet, right?
Not yet.
No Phyrexian werewolves or whatever.
Yeah. So two archetypes, 1.5 archetypes, I'd say. The blue based blue-white enter the battlefield mid-range. I recently cut Panharmonicon, so I need to update this with the more likely card, which is Erratic Portal, which is, just doing a Crystal Shard impression. But Erratic Portal, Crystal Shard, Eldrazi Displacer as just sort of generating, that sort of self-bounce flicker sort of a thing. I was below like 30 creatures with enter the battlefield thing, so as much as I love Panharmonicon, and I really love Panharmonicon, it was too much of a trap. And so it was time to sort of pull that piece of it out. And the last one, this is one of those things that I sort of, was describing as like, hey, what's this new thing happening? What's this design space that Wizards is really looking into? And so this like self-discard matters as a potential archetype, assuming that Wizards continues to give us cards like this. With Containment Construct and Currency Converter, being able to sort of generate value for you based on cards you're discarding, either by allowing you to play them or turning them into other resources, and then looking at all of these cards that actually have discard costs, associated with them. So I have started to refer to this one a little bit as Masticore Tribal, which is not fully accurate, but there are 3 Masticores in the cube, all of whom have every upkeep discard trigger. And so the ability to sort of combine Containment Construct with these, self-discard triggers to actually be able to play all the cards that you're seeing, I think is really, really cool. And to have seen, Bag of Holding a couple years ago, which is sort of a little bit of the beginning of this, but Bag of Holding quickly give way to Currency Converter and Containment Construct, which are these much, much, much more powerful cards that have this ability. This is design space that Wizards seems to be exploring as part of sort of colorless identity.
Yes.
And like that to me is really exciting. And I would love to see if this gets pushed at all. It doesn't need to get pushed far for this to become like a more and more interesting archetype for the cube to have. But I was super excited to see Containment Construct get very quickly followed up by Currency Converter. I thought that was a really, really exciting signal for what could be something cool to join this cube.
Yeah, I think the design space is wonderful. I play Currency Converter in my cube, and it's very powerful. And I think Containment Construct is one of the most subtly powerful cards they printed this year. I think this card is unreal, man. Yeah. Yeah.
That's very exciting. Austin, Conjurer's Closet, yes, I think it's a little bit too slow, and I think it has the same sort of density problem as it has the same density problem as the as Panharmonicon. Lupine Prototype is definitely something that would be on my list if we can get to sort of a better discard matters sort of archetype. I would definitely be on board with sort of figuring out how to get something like Lupine Prototype in there. For sure, I think that would be very exciting.
Yeah.
If we can figure out how to get that working.
Cool. I mean, there's so much. So like, one thing I was thinking about while you were explaining the archetype layout was like, what do I have to care about when I'm drafting these decks? And I like that, like, so for the aggressive decks, I'm looking for like each kind of I don't want to call them macro archetypes, but like each game plan you care about such different types of cards. It's not like everybody's looking for Mind Stones or everybody's looking for end ramp payoffs. You have these you have defensive speed, lands as like a priority. You have 1-drops and equipment as a priority. There's a lot of ways of approaching the draft that
Yeah.
and ways you can build, like things that you can see as necessary for your archetypes that you want to look for, and it's great. I really love it. I need to explore more. I need to play more of this cube.
Yeah, it's a weird one, but like that's the joy in it for me, is just having something that is so bizarre and off the wall, and still works, and still has coherent archetypes, and like and not just like coherent archetypes, but coherent archetypes that have their own kind of like different flavors of them. Right? It's like I can play mono red, or I can play mono white, or I can play Boros, and each of those, in a traditional cube, and each one of those feels different and is optimizing for slightly different play patterns and slightly different types of cards and effects. And this kind of does the same thing without any colors, and it's very bizarre. And I'm sure there's people where they're just like, this is not for me at all. But
yeah.
It is a wild experience. I love watching people draft it for the first time. And a lot of times first-time drafters, like, they see a very powerful card, and they see a very powerful contextual card, and they're like, this card must be insane, right? They see a cranial plating, or they see, Smuggler's Copter, right? So a card that is contextually obscenely powerful in this cube, and a card that is uncontextually very, very strong.
Yeah.
And people can kind of look at both of those and be like, both of these cards are extremely good in this cube.
Yeah.
But they all, Urza's Saga is one that's just like, people look at it and be like, well, this has to be insane, right? And like, the answer is, yeah, it is. It is a very, very powerful Magic card here. But it's still, it's all sort of coherent in a way that's really, really fun. So I really, I'm very proud of it. It's a thing that I really love.
Yeah, there is a metagame here, which is an accomplishment.
Yeah, for sure.
You got this far, and that you got this far with it, that you established a metagame is like really commendable. So it's awesome, man. Okay, I guess I'm all out of questions. Do you have any that you want to ask, or are you good? We've been talking for like 2 hours already.
No, I think I've covered a lot of just like the way that I think about cube, the way I think about design, how this monstrosity turned into a thing that like is really kind of like quite coherent in a way. I hope that people want to draft it at CubeCon. I'm like a little bit worried about CubeCon that we won't have enough drafters. So like I'm like, I think there's going to be like a second tier metagame at CubeCon, which is like, okay, this many people got cubes in, are we gonna have enough drafters for all of them?
Yeah.
I know. And so like as a designer, I'm now like, I really hope that I get positive fire. But at the end of the day, like it's a super honor to have been sort of selected, especially that I didn't have to go through the bracket system. That sort of there's interest from the organizers up front. That was really, really kind and generous. And I am really hopeful that people get to try this and have a blast doing it. So
yeah.
I think that's my sort of final thought.
Yeah.
We're, sub 60 days now. J-Bro has a counter running on all of his cube draft videos. So every once in a while I'll pop into his stream and be like, 55 days left.
Yeah, exactly. I woke up today, I was like, 51 days. Wow, okay.
Yeah.
This is getting really close. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know. I think signups are done, apparently, in like 6 days. This was like news to me.
So my understanding is in 6 days, Gamehole Con is closing their badge pre-reg process. And so when they close their badge pre-reg process, it also closes the window for CubeCon, because essentially you need a Gamehole Con badge to get into CubeCon. So if they're not selling any more sort of pre-registered badges, they can't sell any more CubeCon tickets, right? So they will have sort of day of available passes, but then it becomes kind of harder for the CubeCon folks to know, what's going to happen, what's it going to be like if I go on a day, will they have a pass that day, etc.
Right.
So if you're watching this and thinking about going to CubeCon, highly recommend kind of like locking that in sooner rather than later. But yeah, otherwise, Cube.
Yes. cube. Yeah. All right. Well, then I guess that's gonna do it then. So where can people find you? Let's leave with that.
Yeah, so people can find me on Twitter at the handle at WorkLifeValue. I probably should update that to Isticle, honestly. It would be a more coherent thing. You can find me on CubeCobra, the username Isticle. All of my CubeCobra profile is linked to in my Twitter bio. You can find all of the crazy cubes that I work on. I maintain like 9 different cubes as sort of different thought experiments. And I update almost all of them every set release. I occasionally close out ones that I've decided I'm bored of, but there's a pretty long list there. You can check out the Versus Cube if that is somehow interesting to you. Maybe someday I'll write up a comprehensive rules thing for Versus or an intro rules thing for Versus so people can look at it.
Sure.
Yeah, those are the best places to find me. I'm on Discord in a variety of different Discords. I'm in your Discord. I'm in some New York City Magic Discords. You can find me in the CubeCon Discord. I post a Pack One Pick One every Friday from the Devoid Cube. I post it generally both in Reddit and in Twitter. So feel free to keep an eye out for that. It's always fun to see what different people think, and I try to make those interesting. So that's about it from me.
All right, and that's it for me too. I'm here every week on Monday, and I'll be doing, actually my next one is on Sunday, and I'm interviewing the Uber Bear Cube people.
Nice.
And I think there's 2 of them, so I guess it's going to be 3 people on the stream on Sunday. I don't know. I'm going to be going to the pre-release, and then I'm going to be interviewing them, so it's going to be a fun day. Anyway, so look out for me then, and until then, thank you so much. Thank you, Dan.